Okay, so I've got the last slot for the afternoon, and I've got the joy of looking at the adequacy of Section 7 in 5 minutes or less, which is probably not going to be possible, so I'll take a little bit more. First, I want to apologise that I don't have a written paper for you all today. I've been battling technology issues up in Myanmar last week, got back this morning, and I had to battle with dial-up connection up there, so I couldn't send anything back to New Zealand. But we'll make that available to everybody, well, next week, early next week. So, Section 7 of the Bill of Rights. Does everybody know what that is, what that requires? Is there anybody who needs a summary of that? No? So it's a reporting requirement. The Attorney General must report to the House of Parliament on any inconsistency in a proposed piece of legislation with the Bill of Rights. Now, what do we think the purpose of that provision is? Because I've got to look at the adequacy of Section 7, whether it's working. So what's the purpose of Section 7? Why would we have this reporting obligation? Does anybody hazard a guess?
So Parliament's well informed.
So Parliament's well informed. So that's one of them. Yep. So to raise awareness in Parliament and to enable debate on human rights issues as bills go through Parliament. And there's also another purpose. Yep.
New Zealand lacks like a Senate or anything that can check Parliament's power.
Yep.
And the process of legislation.
Okay. Yep. That does lack a Senate. But what would the purpose of Section 7 be? It doesn't achieve that. What it does try to achieve is it acts as a carrot. So it tries to encourage the executive to comply with the Bill of Rights. Okay? This is the idea, that when they draft a piece of legislation, they don't want to have an adverse Bill of Rights vet, because then potentially that will be debated in Parliament and they will have to answer to that. So if we look at each one of those separately, raising awareness in Parliament to enable debate on human rights issues. Do you think the Section 7 obligation achieves that? No? Yeah. So what it does, so not every bill has a Section 7 report presented to Parliament. Okay, so when the Attorney General, on the advice of Crown Law, on the advice of the Ministry of Justice, determines that a bill is either consistent with the Bill of Rights or it's prima facie inconsistent, but they consider that it's justified, then no Section 7 report is presented to Parliament. However, what has happened since 2003 is all that advice that goes to the Attorney General is available. So parliamentarians can still see that advice and still consider the human rights implications of a particular piece of legislation. So if we look at two recent bits of legislation, the Foreshore and Seabed and the Electoral Finance Bill, both of those raised significant human rights issues but did not have a Bill of Rights vet. However, if we look at the parliamentary debates, if we look at the Select Committee debates, the advice given to the Attorney General was raised in those debates. Okay. Likewise, where a Section 7 report is actually presented to the House, we see that reflected in parliamentary debate and in Select Committee debates. So, short answer, yes, it probably is raising awareness in Parliament for the purpose of discussing human rights issues. But what if a piece of legislation is amended in the process? So the Bill of Rights vet comes to the House of Parliament on introduction, and then the bill goes through the various stages, goes to Select Committee, comes back, supplementary order papers can be presented amending the bill. There's no subsequent analysis or vet of those amendments. So there's potential at that stage for things to happen which have implications for rights, and there's no way of assessing that and presenting that back to the House. So my first answer is a yes, but there's scope to improve there. If we look at the second purpose, to encourage executive compliance with the Bill of Rights. And we look back, if we look at in 2010, there were 51 at that stage, 51 Section 7 reports having been presented to the House. Okay, so 51 times at that point where the Attorney General said, look, this legislation is inconsistent with the Bill of Rights. In how many cases do you think those bills were withdrawn or defeated?
None.
None? No, a few more than that. So 21 times the bill was either withdrawn or defeated on vote. Okay? 10 times they were amended, and 20 times it was passed unchanged.
How many were members' bills?
Exactly, that's the question. So overwhelmingly, the withdrawn or defeated ones are private members' bills. Okay, so of the 51, it was 26 were private members' bills, and 25 were government bills, and of the withdrawn and defeated ones, it was over 80% were private members' bills. So what we see is that it can work, but it works when you don't have a political interest in the bill. So what tends to happen is the Bill of Rights vet happens right at the end of the policy and legislative development process. So the government's gone through this whole stage of developing a policy, deciding what the bill's going to look like. They've developed all that, and then it tootles off to the Ministry of Justice or to Crown Law for an assessment of compliance with the Bill of Rights. So at that point, the horse is bolted. There's the political will to advance that policy. So it's very difficult at that point then to have an effect. Which brings me to my next point, that I believe because of that, because it's right at the end of the development process, this creates a culture of justification in the analysis itself. So whether it's with Crown Law, whether it's with the Ministry of Justice, when they're looking at a bill, they're looking straight away at whether a bill, the inconsistency can be justified or not, and they're making that assessment. So they're not providing information to Parliament on the potential inconsistencies and allowing that debate of whether it's justified or not to happen in the House rather than within the departments themselves. So that's how it happens, but there are other structures and mechanisms in place that could pick up the gap. So, for example, the Cabinet Manual requires each department to advise Cabinet of any implications that proposed legislation will have with the Bill of Rights, Human Rights Act and international human rights obligations. Now this happens at a much earlier stage. So this happens in the development of the policy, development of the legislation. So this is at a point where you can work a little bit more and make amendments and adjustments in an easier fashion than you can at the final vetting process. However, this very, very rarely happens. And it very rarely happens for two reasons. One, there's a lack of awareness of the human rights obligations. And two, because officials fall back to the Bill of Rights vet to pick up that analysis. So what we often see is a one-line sentence in these Cabinet papers: there's no human rights implications. And then we get to the Bill of Rights vet and we get an adverse Bill of Rights vet. So obviously there were human rights implications. So in my view, there needs to be some significant work at that area at the early policy development stage to make sure that human rights implications are taken into account and to pick up the potential adverse effects that can come through in legislation. Now, last year the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights reviewed New Zealand and raised these issues. The government at that point responded and acknowledged that there were processes in place, acknowledged that the Cabinet Manual process was there and that it was a good process, could be used well, but that needs to be strengthened and needs to be used more consistently. The final issue I'll just raise really briefly is independence and whether the Attorney-General is the right person to be conducting an assessment as to whether a government bill is consistent with the Bill of Rights. Does anybody have any views on that?
It's a fair point because they are members of a
Mm-hmm.
So how independent?
Yep.
Well, yes, yet on the other hand, some attorneys, some included here, have
Yep.
written some pretty brave reports.
Exactly. Yep.
And I've noticed that, like particularly in the current government, when you have a current Attorney General write an adverse report and they still ignore him, I think that's actually a really big deal.
Yep.
It makes it even more noticeable.
Yeah. So I personally don't think there is an issue at all. I think the way that the law officer role of an Attorney General in New Zealand is established and it's framed and it's respected, it provides that independence to be able to undertake that task. And as we say, we've seen instances where there's been adverse reports from the Attorney General that have been ignored, but that's a case of political will to push something forward rather than a case of lack of independence. So I don't see that as a major issue, but there is a perception there that because they are a member of Parliament as well, that there could be issues in certain cases.
I just think perhaps that with a little caveat that some more work on transparency could be done just to protect that position from lobbying itself, because that is, if it hasn't happened, that's great, but that it won't happen isn't the same thing without protection.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I think where there is the potential, it's not actually in the Attorney General itself, it's in the fact that the advice is coming from departments, coming from officials. And so there's a risk of lack of independence at that level rather than the Attorney General themselves. So thoughts very quickly of how things could develop. I think that Section 7 reports should be tabled in all instances where there's a prima facie inconsistency with the Bill of Rights. I think the debate around justification should be happening in the House and should be transparent in that way. I think that an assessment and a vet should happen at each stage of the legislative process. So if a supplementary order paper is introduced, there should be an assessment at that stage whether there's any Bill of Rights implications. And again, that just adds to the transparency both for parliamentarians and their assessment, but also for the public, so they can see what's going on and why the government may or may not have decided that a particular path is justified. And I also think that the effect of Section 7 would be greatly strengthened if the Cabinet Manual requirements themselves worked better and picked up some of the issues at an earlier stage in the policy development process. So with that, I'll leave it there unless there's any other questions.